Hello everyone. Tonight we are going to walk through forgotten alleys, where the air smells of smoke, grease and crushed leaves.
These are not the streets of Paris or Rome.
They are the alleys of medieval fairs, hidden between stone walls and ancient silences.
There, amidst the sound of the leather of shoes and the rustle of cloaks, food was not just sustenance. It was warmth, it was memory, it was secret pleasure.
So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there.
I like to imagine the night map lighting up, dot by dot, as we meet here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft humming in the background.
Or perhaps imagine it's the wind blowing through the tents at a medieval fair.
The breeze carries with it the aroma of fried dumplings, aged and slowly stirring broths.
Let's begin tonight's journey together. Not all food that survives history comes in banquets or golden manuscripts.
Some survive only in whispers, in the accounts of absent-minded travellers, in chronicles forgotten in the corners of a monastery, or in the shining eyes of a peasant who remembers the taste of warm bread stolen from the oven.
Tonight, we will not talk about noble dishes or sacred recipes.
We will listen to the stomachs of the common people, the appetites of those who lived in a hurry and in the cold, of children running around with sticky fingers, of old people eating slowly under the shade of a cart.
We will talk about invisible food
and delicious food, the kind that was lost in the wind, but left its taste in the memory.
They fried, smoked, mashed, and sweetened with whatever was available.
Nothing was thrown away. Everything became a snack.
A turnip became a dumpling.
An aged cheese became a gift. A stale bread came to life in boiling fat. And so, the first snacks, the medieval junk foods, emerged. Improvised, tasty, and above all,
human.
Perhaps, if you closed your eyes right now, you could feel the crunch of a snack made with coarse flour and dried herbs.
Or the smell of old oil mixing with garlic and onion.
The curious thing is that, even with few ingredients and almost no resources, they knew how to provoke pleasure. They knew how to create comfort.
They knew how to feed more than just the body.
So let's taste with our ears, bite with our memory,
feel with our soul. Because tonight, the stars shine over the stone streets, and the ancient flavors are about to awaken. At dusk, when the sun was setting between the towers of the walls, and the wind was bringing the first whispers of night, there was a corner of the market where time seemed to stand still. There, a cauldron bubbled over black stones, and a woman with dark hands was molding small balls of dough with herbs.
She dropped them carefully into the hot oil, and the hissing sound was like a greeting. It was the sound of the day coming to an end, the sound of hunger being welcomed. Around her, children waited in silence. There was no rush, just attentive eyes and stretched noses. When the first snack came out, golden and fragrant, the magic began. It was made of almost nothing.
A handful of coarse flour, perhaps mixed with the remains of grated vegetable. A touch of coarse salt, perhaps a little wild garlic crushed with the tip of a fist.
None of that mattered as much as the feel.
The texture that melted in the mouth like warm sand. The contrast between the crispy crust and the still moist interior.
It didn't nourish like a banquet,
but it nourished the soul. It was a gift for the day, an edible reminder of the effort of existing.
The vendors didn't follow recipes. They improvised according to the harvest, the weather, luck. Sometimes they used flowers, sometimes peels, sometimes a piece of hard cheese grated on top.
Other times, just silence. And even then, it was a silence that crackled. The pieces were small, just the size of a dildo.
Too small to share, but big enough to warm the chest. They were eaten slowly, as if each bite was stored in an invisible safe.
The people who sold these snacks rarely had names.
They were the old lady on the corner, the boy with the cart, the tobacco man. Their faces disappeared in the smoke, but their flavors remained in the memory. What we now call junk food, in the Middle Ages, was a moment of humanity, a gesture,
a discreet affection. Often, the person preparing the snack didn't even eat it. They watched with pleasure as the other person ate.
It was a silent exchange, a brief pact, sealed by fat and loud eyes.
And there was wisdom there.
Something ancestral, something that escapes us.
They knew that pleasure doesn't have to be grand, that gluttony can be a way of giving thanks, that the smell of frying can be more therapeutic than any medicine.
The oil was reused until the end. The spices came from the forest.
Nothing came in packages. Nothing had a brand.
And yet, it cured,
or at least made us forget for a few minutes that the world was hard, that winter was coming, that hunger was always lurking around the next corner.
These medieval snacks did not survive in recipes,
but they survived in when we miss something we have never eaten, when we crave a flavor we do not know, when we hear a sizzle in a frying pan and feel comfort. It is the memory of the body recognizing an ancient history.
An ancestral custom that returns to remind us that, in the end, we all just want a little warmth in our hands and something crunchy between our teeth.
Something simple,
Something ours.
and perhaps that is why silence is also a season.
Because in this meal, there was room for the sound of one's own thoughts, for the crackling of the embers, for the chewing of those who still dream of peaceful days. Now, if you take a deep breath, you might still be able to smell the smell of that fare in the air, but the sweet treat is right there, in front of you.
A touch of honey dripping from forgotten dates.
A sweetness that didn't come from the shelf, but from the earth. Let's go there, together. Because the next bite will be made of memories.
And old sugar.
There was a different stillness on the nights when sweets were prepared.
Not confectionery sweets, not desserts with names, but sweet, simple things that dripped from the fingers and stuck to the lips.
Sweetness in those days was an event. Something rare, almost ceremonial. And when it came, it was like a pause in the world. The eyes closed instinctively. The tongue explored with reverence.
Sometimes it was just a piece of nut dipped in honey. Other times, a root cooked until soft, sweetened with patience.
The form didn't matter. What mattered was the gesture.
These sweets didn't come packaged. They came picked, brought from the land like little offerings.
Dates stuffed with seeds, dried fruits covered with golden cinnamon dust, honey crystallized in flakes of bark.
It was a different kind of luxury.
One that required time, careful hand, silence, sometimes just waiting.
Because the flavor came after the wait.
And the wait was part of the flavor.
Eating sweets back then was almost like lighting a candle in the dark. It lit up the inside.
The night markets had their own aroma, a mix of firewood, sweat, and anticipation. The torches flickered and the children's eyes lit up when they saw a basket covered in thick cloth.
Inside, there was something rare. A handful of figs, a bar of fruit paste wrapped in leaves, a piece of sweet, dried pumpkin.
The sounds around them faded.
Because at that moment, the hunger was different. It was a desire for affection, not sustenance. A desire to remember that there was beauty even at the end of the day.
They were silent sweets, made without haste,
Stored with care,
donated with pride. There was no sugar as we know it.
honey reigned supreme.
Thick, dark, almost solid.
Extracted with risk from the wild bees that buzzed in the woods.
It was a honey that carried history,
That stuck in the throat as a memory, and that lasted.
even when the night passed, even when winter arrived,
It was still there, stored in clay pots.
waiting for the right moment. Maybe that was what made these sweets so powerful. The wait, the care, the time between picking and tasting.
Different from the rush we have today, of packaged, immediate, forgettable sweets. There, in the shadows of the Middle Ages, each piece was a store.
Each bite, a pause.
People didn't eat just any way they wanted. They ate as if they were praying. They ate as if they were giving thanks.
And the body understood. The sweetness spread slowly, and the world became less heavy for a moment.
And there was always someone preparing more.
An old man stirring a syrup over low heat.
A young woman piling fruit into baskets.
A child gathering leaves to wrap. The entire community came together around that sweet gesture.
Because they knew, deep down, that it wasn't just food.
It was care.
It was sharing.
It was comfort. A sweet treat might not fill the belly, but it soothed the spirit.
And perhaps that was even more important in times of cold and uncertainty.
And now, with our eyes still fixed on that amber glow of honey, we can move on. The next step takes us to something denser,
Something harder. A food that could save or damn.
a loaf of bread.
But not just any loaf.
The loaf from the corner. That could kill you or save you. Let's go to it.
Slowly, like someone crossing a cobblestone street, with their hands full of ancient bran. Because some bites came with risk.
And yet, they were desired. It was common to smell bread fresh from a rustic oven when turning a corner. But unlike today, this aroma was not automatically synonymous with comfort.
Medieval bread was an enigma.
Sometimes it was a cure, sometimes a punishment.
The flour that made it could come from clean wheat, or from leftovers, from contaminated grains, from husks ground together with tiny stones.
And even so, no one hesitated when faced with a warm loaf of bread.
Because back then, bread was more than food.
It was the fine line between continuing and giving up.
Often, what was eaten did not even deserve to be called bread.
It was a dark, rough dough, dense as clay, without refined fermentation, without lightness. And yet, it was received with gratitude. The improvised bakeries used noisy mills, and the dust that spread into the air was more grey than golden.
Flour mixed with time.
Each piece was like a brick of life, and eating it was almost an act of courage.
Because you never knew what was inside.
It could be nutrition.
It could be poison. There was bread of all kinds, sour rye, oats mixed with roots, leftovers from fairs. And there was also the bread of the devout, the bread of offerings, the kind broken with reverence.
But the bread of the people, the kind from the street, was different.
It came wrapped in reused cloths. It came dirty, with ash marks, with burnt edges.
But it came warm, and that was enough.
Because heat was a promise.
Heat brought hope. Even when biting it made your teeth grind. Sometimes the bread hurt.
Literally.
Teeth broke. Gums bled.
There were invisible fungi that caused hallucination. But even so, it was eaten. Because hunger was greater than fear.
Eating bread was accepting the risk. It was telling the body, I'm still here. I'm still trying. And between the crunching sounds of chewing, there was also a kind of pride.
A kind of ancestral stubbornness that said, the world is difficult, but so am I.
Bread was currency. It was a symbol. It was a companion.
It was taken on trips, broken in silence between two brothers, dipped in thick broths as the last meal of a day without light.
And sometimes, just sometimes, it was truly delicious.
It had texture, aroma, softness.
In those days, bread became almost a celebration.
It was shared with a small smile, as if keeping a secret.
And each piece was valued as if it were gold.
Because at that moment, it was. The funny thing is that, looking back, bread teaches us about acceptance, about patience,
about limits, about what is essential. Today, we seek softness, crunchiness, perfect fermentation. But back then, they were just looking for relief.
A minute of sustenance, a handful of strength.
And bread offered that, even when it came hard, even when it hurt.
Because there was something stronger there, something that reminds us that eating, in the end, is always an act of faith.
And if we close our eyes now, perhaps we can feel the texture of that coarse bread, the shy warmth that escaped between the cracks, and the sound of the silent bite.
But right there, further ahead, there is another smell forming.
A smell of boiling oil,
of roots soaked in fat. It is time to visit the fried places in the countryside,
where the food sizzled like live coals and comfort came in the form of oily dumpling. The sound was unmistakable. A long, almost musical hiss that emerged from the silence of the clearings and announced that there was food on the fire. It was not the hiss of the cities. It was the hiss of mobile tents, of camps between villages, of fields where travelers stopped to warm their hands and feed their souls.
There, amidst the smoke and crushed grass, the fried foods of the countryside appeared.
Fritters of grated turnip, roots breaded with nettle flour, small pieces of meat dipped in hot oil until golden. It was the improvisation that fed. It was the smell that attracted. The wood crackled beneath the pot. The wind carried the aroma along the dirt paths.
And even those who weren't hungry came closer, because there was something hypnotic about the oily heat that enveloped the food.
The fat enveloped everything.
Your clothes, your hair, the sky. But it also enveloped your spirit. It was as if that moment watching food transform into something crispy brought back a kind of peace.
A sense of control, however small, over the chaos of peasant life. The women who fried the food knew this. They stirred the spawn with steady hands, attentive eyes, and few words. Sometimes a soft song escaped their lips, not to entertain, but to calm the oil. Some believed that the food absorbed the mood of the person cooking.
And so it was necessary to be present.
Breathe slowly, pray quietly. Each dumpling that came out of the oil was placed on dry cloths and left there to rest, like someone returning from the fields after a long day.
There were no clear rules about what could or couldn't be fried.
Hunger decided. If there were carrots, they were toasted. If there was fish, they were crispy. Even flowers and leaves found their place in the oil. And it wasn't out of vanity, but out of necessity. Frying preserved. Frying hid imperfections. Frying created flavor where before there had been only surplus.
It was an everyday alchemy, an empirical science that was born of need.
And of the non-negotiable desire to feel pleasure.
They sat around the fire.
They passed the dumplings from hand to hand. They ate without cutlery, without plates, with their fingers still dirty from their work.
And there was muffled laughter.
Whispered comments about who had made the best dumpling of the night.
The silence that accompanied the chewing was full of respect, because everyone knew that this food was a victory.
A small triumph against scarcity, against boredom, against fatigue. It was simple, but it was everything. And even today, so many centuries later, perhaps the body still recognizes that his...
The dense aroma that foretells something good.
Maybe that's why, when we hear the oil bubbling in a nighttime kitchen, we feel immediate comfort.
As if some ancient memory awakens and says, everything is fine.
The food is coming. You are safe. You can relax. Because the world can wait a little longer. In the meantime, the frying takes care of you. And with our fingers still greasy from our imagination, we headed to a more discreet corner of the village. A crooked alley, among barrels and hanging clothes, where flavors are hidden that were not made to impress. but rather to console. There are the dumplings from the back street, the most daring, the tastiest, and also the most secret, because pleasure was not always allowed, and eating in secret was sometimes the only form of freedom. Let's go there, calmly and with curious eyes. The back street was not marked on maps. It was discovered by its smells,
by the heat that escaped through cracks, by the muffled sounds of timid frying and broken conversation.
It was there that the most desired dumplings in the village took shape.
Made by calloused hands, hidden under handkerchiefs darkened by time.
They were not sold with pride.
They were passed discreetly, wrapped in cloths, sometimes delivered in the early hours of the morning.
And even so, they were the most sought after.
Because they knew more.
They knew secrets.
They knew pleasure. The ingredients came from nowhere.
Or almost.
Reused peels, salvaged bran, forgotten roots.
Everything was turned into dough. Everything took shape. And after being shaped, the dumplings were dipped in hot oil and returned transformed.
The fat worked magic. It created a crust, gilded the story, sealed the emotion. Whoever took a bite closed their eyes, not out of politeness, but because their memory wanted to remember everything.
The texture, the heat,
the feeling of eating something forbidden, and for that very reason precious.
People ate quickly, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with euphoria. Their eyes met in the dark.
A wave was enough to ask for another, and another.
Because there,
in those unguarded alleys, hunger was not just physical. It was emotional. It was a hole in the chest, dug by a routine that was too hard. And the dumplings filled that hole, temporarily.
But with dignity, with flavor, with the kind of comfort that cannot be bought in public squares, nor found on the tables of nobles. There were those who condemned these snacks. They said they were impure, that they came from dirty hands, from smelly places, from culinary sins. But those who ate them knew. They knew that dirt was appearance, that the taste came from the soul, that the seasoning was life.
And that behind each dumpling, there was a woman who lost everything and still continued to cook. A young man who had never learned to read, but knew how to fry perfectly. Invisible people, but essential. They were cakes of resistance,
of survival,
of hidden tenderness. And for that very reason, they were so delicious, because they had a soul, they had context,
they had a past, and whoever ate them, in a way, was part of something bigger.
Of a chain of affection, defied hunger, fear, judgment. It was like whispering a secret to your own stomach.
Like saying, I deserve this.
Even if it's hidden.
Even if it's brief.
Even if no one knows.
And even today, when we eat something forbidden, we feel that ancestral spark.
The tiny joy that arises when pleasure mixes with risk, when the tongue finds a memory it didn't know it had.
Maybe they're echoes of those little cakes. Maybe our body still knows the way to the back street, even without remembering the name, even without ever having been there.
Because there are flavors that travel with us.
Invisible, but persistent. And now, following the discreet sound of fat still sizzling in the distance, we approach a more lively scene. A night market, torches flickering, voices drawn out by fatigue, and the sound of the pot bubbling like gentle thunder. Let's go there.
Because at that market, the noise of food was more soothing than silence. And what was noise became song. At night, the medieval fairs changed tone.
The buzz of negotiations turned to a murmur. Voices trailed off, sleepily, carrying the weight of the day. The lit torches did not illuminate everything, only suggested outlines.
Faces appeared and disappeared among dancing shadows, but there was a constant, comforting sound that filled the air like a warm blanket.
The sound of fat sizzling,
of the pot that would not rest, of food that resisted the darkness with its promise of warmth. That sound was almost a melody, a symphony of pops, bubbles, and hot hisses. With each hiss, an aroma emerged.
Turnips, onions, pieces of meat that crackled in old oil, and people, like moths, approached. There were no announcements, no signs, no shouts, just the sound of food being cooked. And that was enough.
The body understood.
The stomach woke up, and the soul smiled.
Because in that smoke there was security.
There was continuity. There was life. The vendors hardly spoke. Their hands worked in repetitive, hypnotic gestures, like an ancient ritual.
They picked up, shaped, fried, drained, delivered. A simple cycle, but full of meaning. And whoever received it ate in silence.
Not for lack of words, but out of respect. For the food, for the moment, for the mystery of something so simple causing so much comfort.
The fat dripped down their fingers.
Their eyes closed. The world, for a moment, seemed less threatening. The fat was ancient.
It carried flavors from yesterday, the day before, and months ago.
It was like a thick river where memories floated. With each new frying, the oil gained more depth, and whoever ate it felt it, even without knowing it. Because the flavor didn't come only from the food.
It came from the history of the oil, From the wood used, from the time it took for the fire to heat up, from the whispered conversation while the dough rested. Eating there was like diving into an invisible line of time.
The children ran between the shacks, attracted by the sounds and smells, and sometimes they got a free cake,
A piece of something sweet, a sip of thick broth.
It was the silent generosity of the stallholders who knew that feeding was also loving,
And feeding at night was protecting, like lighting a candle against fear.
as if to say, without saying it, you are safe here. You can sit down, you can eat.
You can close your eyes for a moment.
Even today, when the modern world tries to silence the sounds of the kitchen, there is something that resists. The hiss of the pan continues to be a whisper of care.
A reminder that the body needs more than nutrient.
It needs ritual,
Sounds that comfort,
smells that welcome, and perhaps a small explosion of flavor amidst the fatigue, like in the fairs of old, like that long ago night when the pan spoke.
and everyone listened.
And now that the sound of grease is fading, we hear another kind of whisper.
A more restrained one that hides in the corridors of castles.
There, where nobles secretly stole recipes from peasants.
They took their sweet potato cakes and pretended they had been created in the royal kitchens. Forbidden pleasure has a more intense taste.
What was dirty has become luxury.
Let us listen.
Silently, but with curiosity.
In the cold corridors of the castle, where the silence was broken only by the rustling of skirts and the echo of footsteps on stone, a secret was slowly spreading.
It was not a political conspiracy.
It was not a hidden war.
It was a recipe, or rather, a flavor.
Something that came from the streets, from the fairs, from the poor kitchen. The nobles, accustomed to ceremonial banquet, began to desire the simple taste of the servants' food. But they could not admit this in public.
And so they stole in silence. It was the sweet potato dumpling, kneaded with country herbs and fried in fat, that I had never seen in a palace. It was the moist rye bread, with a crust that crunched between your teeth. It was the salty paste made from forgotten grains, spread on fresh leaves. The peasants made it out of necessity.
The nobles tried it out of desire, and little by little, they sent servants to learn the gestures, to recreate the flavors.
But they gave them new names. They decorated the dishes with French words.
And they pretended to have invented it.
The cooks of the people knew.
They felt it.
Some smiled in silence, watching their dishes pass through walls. Others were saddened, because they saw their creations losing their soul.
But they all understood what was happening.
Taste has no owner. Hunger does not recognize hierarchies. And pleasure.
Well, pleasure does not bow before titles.
What was dirty on the street became refined in the dining room. But the flavor remained the same, and perhaps even more alive when hidden.
Eating in secret is a powerful act.
An act of intimacy. And the nobles did it with devotion. Sometimes they hid cakes in leather bags.
Sometimes they asked to eat with their hands, away from the eyes of the hall. It was a surrender, a return to something simpler, more true.
As if, for a moment, they stopped being counts, barons, princesses,
and were just human, biting into something warm and imperfect.
Something real.
Something that didn't come with gilded china.
And so, luxury was reinvented.
Not with truffles or expensive wines, but with recycled leftovers and recipes without limits.
The dishes of the common people became fashionable in royal kitchen.
But they lost their improvisation. They gained control, rigidity, vanity.
The flavor was still there, but the gesture was different. And perhaps, deep down, the nobles knew this.
That's why they continue to order the original.
Hot, cheap, anonymous, eaten in the early hours of the morning, far from the eyes of the world.
Today, when a simple dish gains fame and becomes gourmet, perhaps we are reliving this cycle. The desire for what is authentic.
For what comes from the ground, from sweat, from necessity. The difference is that now we have a choice.
We can enjoy it without shame.
We can recognize where it came from and be thankful,
not only for the food, but for the story it carries.
For the body that shaped it, for the life that inspired it.
Because every dish has a past.
And while this past still echoes in our taste buds, we move forward, now along the path of those who walked a lot, of those who carried food on their backs, between trails and forests, between villages and dangers.
Let's get to know the snacks of medieval travelers.
Foods that fit in your pocket, but carried the whole world in flavor.
Made to last, made to comfort, made to accompany the silence of the road.
Let's go. It's still night.
There's still a way. The road was long and unforgiving. Hard-packed dirt, loose stones, cold wind that cut the skin like an invisible knife.
And yet, men and women walked,
with a walking stick in one hand and a bundle in the other.
Inside the bundle, few items, but among them, there was always food.
Not fresh food, not banquet.
Just the essential.
Food that would withstand time, heat, and solitude.
And in this small space, the traveller's comfort lived. A piece of hardened cheese,
A piece of dried meat, a handful of nuts or toasted grains. These snacks were companions. They were almost characters on the journey.
they were present in moments of pause, in the shade of large trees, or beside poorly built campfires.
The traveller knew them well. He knew the texture, the sound of the bite, the smell that announced when they were past their prime.
And yet, he kept them with care, because each bite was a reminder, I'm still here.
I'm still going. There's still a path.
Eating, in those moments, was a silent conversation with one's own strength. Mouldy cheese was not discarded, it was revered.
Mold was a sign of age, of resistance. It was proof that the food had survived more than one climate, more than one frontier.
The dried meat was as tough as leather, but a sip of warm water, or a little patience was enough to soften it. And then it revealed its deep, salty, almost mineral flavor. It was like chewing time, like feeling in your mouth the days that had accumulated under the sun, between dust and fatigue. There were no plates, no tablecloths. The meal was eaten with the hands,
On rocks, on knees, on maps.
and yet there was beauty.
The simplicity created its own kind of ceremony. The act of opening the cloth, dividing what was left, chewing slowly.
It was almost a ritual of survival.
And there was gratitude,
Even with so little, there was a sense of being alive.
of moving forward, of being part of something bigger. The road, the destination, the world.
And sometimes something sweet would appear.
A piece of dried fruit forgotten at the bottom of the bag.
A small bread with traces of honey. It was like finding an old letter.
Something that brought back memories.
A taste kept from childhood, from home, from the place from which one departed. Because the traveller's food was more than sustenance. It was longing wrapped in fabric.
It was a memory that could not be put into words.
It was a portable home, chewed in silence.
Today, when we prepare snacks for a trip, we rarely think about this.
About the symbolic power of what we bring. About what the food will say about us when we open it somewhere else. But maybe we should. Maybe a piece of hard cheese can still be an anchor.
A fulcrum between distances. A bridge between what we were and what we are trying to be. And maybe that is why these snacks fascinate us so much. Because they carry stories in every bite. And now, slowly returning from the road, we feel a slight effervescence in the air. A bubbling memory that seems to rise through the nostrils and caress the tongue. Mead,
Cherry wines, beers made with beets, fermentations that smile from inside the mug.
it's time to discover the medieval soda.
Not so sweet, but full of poetry. Let's go to it. The bubbles are calling us. It was in the back of taverns, or in the damp corners of monasteries, that the bubbly drinks of the Middle Ages lived. They were not carbonated, as we know them today. They had no labels, no refrigerator.
But they tickle the tongue.
They were alive, fermented with patience and mystery.
Mead as thick as dusk.
Beetroot beer the color of wet earth. Cherry wines with the scent of hidden flowers.
Drinks that danced silently inside barrels and waited for the right moment to awaken the palate.
No one knew exactly how to control the fermentations. They happened, like rain, like sleep, like the phases of the moon.
Roots, fruits, honey. Sometimes stale bread were mixed together.
And then we waited, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, and when the drink foamed or made a soft sound when served, everyone smiled. It was a sign that it was alive. That time had worked well. The first sip was always sacred. It was taken with eyes closed, as if listening to a secret. These drinks weren't just for parties, they were everyday.
They were part of workers' breakfast, travellers' lunches, and cold village nights.
The intoxication was light, almost a sigh. It was less about escaping reality and more about softening,
Making it bearable.
poetic.
Drinking was meditate.
It was chewing on silence. It was accepting the day as it came, and toasting discreetly to one's own existence, to one's own survival. Each tavern had its own formula. No two were the same. The flavors changed with the season, the mood of the brewer, the type of wood used in the barrels.
And this was accepted.
No one wanted standardization. The fun was in the surprise, in the first sip that tugged at the corner of the mouth, in the last that warmed the stomach.
Drinking was an act of surrender,
Of trust.
of communion with the invisible elements that made the magic happen in the dark.
The mugs were simple, made of clay or wood, but inside them, the past bubbled, time bubbled, and those who drank knew that the foam carried stories,
That the acidity carried memories. It was as if the bubbles were laughing softly.
as if they were telling old jokes, understood only by those who had felt the weight of life and still knew how to toast.
The fermentations had no deadline.
Nor owner.
They were made for those who knew how to wait. Today, when we hear the sound of a fizzy drink being opened, perhaps our body remembers.
Without knowing why.
Perhaps there is an echo of those ancient vats within us.
An ancient recognition, an ancestral pleasure. Because even now, in such different times, we still seek the same thing, something that caresses the throat and silently tells us that everything will pass,
that there are enough bubbles for one more sip, for one more night.
And now, amidst the invisible laughter of the bubbles that break apart, we move on to a less clean territory.
A place where hygiene was a luxury and flavor resistant.
Let's find out what it was like to eat with dirty hands, when the grease dripped without guilt,
and pleasure came before rules. Next, we will learn about the delicacies that survived the dust of the days.
and that, even so, fed hearts. In the Middle Ages, the word cleanliness had a different meaning,
A different rhythm.
it was a luxury for the few.
Most people lived with their hands always marked by dirt, smoke, old grease.
But even so, they ate.
And they didn't just eat, they savoured it. They picked up pieces with their fingers, tore them with their nails, licked what was left. Eating was a direct gesture.
No napkin, no ceremony, and in that contact between skin and food, there was something visceral, something real.
Something that modern times have tried to forget. Medieval snacks were not served on plates. They were wrapped in used cloths and handed directly to the hand.
And the hand, in turn, had already done everything. Herded cattle, washed clothes in the river, lit the morning fire. Even so, it brought the food to the mouth with respect, and the mouth received it with pleasure.
It was as if there was a silent pact between dirt and flavor.
An ancient agreement that said, the body knows what is good.
And good is not always clean.
The markets were full of these little foods that stuck to your fingers. Sweet cakes covered in thick honey,
Savory spreads that required licking your lips afterward. Sticky preserved fruits that dripped down your palms. And no one minded, because that was part of the experience, part of the pleasure. A pleasure without fuss, without etiquette, without fear.
Eating with your hands was reconnecting with the essential, with the pure gesture of eating like someone breathing. Even among the poorest, there was a beauty in this chaos, a certain pride in the way people handled food.
It was normal to have dark hands, short nails, and cracked palms. But even so, their eyes would shine when they saw hot food being delivered.
Hunger didn't ask for a towel. It asked for heat. It asked for smell. It asked for something that said, you've lived this far, and now, you deserve this.
You deserve to taste it. You deserve to get your fingers dirty. There were those who turned up their noses.
The richest, the most distant.
But even they, in secret moments, indulged.
They hid pieces behind curtains.
They licked their fingers when no one was looking.
Because deep down, everyone knew eating with your hands was a way of remembering that you are still human. That pleasure lies in small gestures. That dirt does not impede delight.
Sometimes it even intensifies it. Today, in times of hand sanitizer and multiple cutlery, we forget this intimacy with food. But it still lives on.
In an awkward picnic.
In a quick bite between tasks.
In a late night snack with our fingers. And in these moments, our body smiles. Because it remembers.
Because it recognizes it. Because it understands that, deep down, flavor always finds its way.
Even through dirty hands. And now, with our fingers still smeared with imaginary grease, we move on.
Let us observe the food that did not appear in a hurry.
That waited hours, sometimes days, to reveal itself. Pots buried, doughs resting, meat smoking slowly. The ritual of waiting is before us, and with it, a lesson about time.
And about how, sometimes, the deepest flavor is born of patience.
Let us go there.
The fire is still burning,
And there is something cooking in the dark. Not all food in the Middle Ages was improvised.
There were also those that required time,
Slow time, time without haste.
as if the flavor needed to mature along with the day. Pots buried under the hot earth, so that the broths could cook for hours. Pasta left out in the open, covered with cloths, absorbing the wind and the stillness of the night.
Meat hung from the rafters, smoking slowly, taking on the smell of wood and shade. Eating was often a gesture of waiting. People waited like they were praying, in silence, in respect.
There were no timers or alarms,
The body was the one that told them when it was ready.
and there was a wisdom in that.
A rhythm of the world that seemed gentler. Hunger was not satisfied in seconds,
It grew, prepared itself, created space within the person who waited.
and when the food finally arrived, it was like meeting someone you love again. A warm hug from afar.
A well-deserved pleasure. Families gathered around the smell, not the table.
The smell was the first sign that the wait was coming to an end.
It slowly rose through the nostril.
It invaded the house.
It reached the fields. It called the neighbors. And everyone knew. It was almost ready.
But the almost was part of the pleasure, because time made the seasoning. Time, and not just the salt.
The anxiety was sweetened by the expectation.
And when the first spoon dipped into the broth, there was almost commotion.
People didn't eat quickly.
They didn't talk loudly. The meal born of waiting was a ceremony. It was celebrated with closed eyes, with deep silences between chewing. And whoever cooked stayed quiet, watching, feeling in the eyes of others the result of their waiting.
There were no stoves with knobs.
The fire was controlled with patience, with twigs, with prayer.
The flame told the time. The ash marked the stages.
And the flavor was always a surprise. Sometimes the wait was in vain. Wet firewood slowed down the preparation.
The dough went sour. The meat toughened.
But even that was accepted.
As part of the ritual, the food did not come with guarantees. It came with stories, with lessons, with attempts. And failure also fed.
It fed humility,
Laughter.
resilience.
Because those who wait to eat
Learn to eat with a lighter heart. And that, perhaps, is the greatest seasoning of all. Today, everything is instantaneous. In minutes, we have ready-made dishes, heated by machines that don't breathe.
But haven't we lost something along the way?
The beauty of delay, the intimacy with time, the smell that spreads little by little, the anxiety that turns into gratitude. Maybe we can still reclaim that. Cook slowly, wait calmly,
Eat with more soul. Because some bites.
are worth waiting for.
And now, from the heat of waiting, we move on to the call of silence.
Let's visit the monks' sweets, made in hidden monasteries, where each bite was a prayer. Sweets made with chestnuts, honey, and herbs, created not to impress, but to meditate.
It's time to walk in silence, among candles and low chants.
Because the next flavor comes wrapped in faith. Within the cold stone walls, where time moved in long, slow steps, the monks cultivated more than silence. They cultivated sweetness. Not the sweetness that shouts, that explodes, that competes.
But a sweetness that sits beside the soul and breathes with.
The sweets made in the monasteries were like that. Soft, modest, deep, thick honey cakes with herbs from the cloister. Chestnut cookies kneaded with the palms of their hands. Thick, almost calm liqueurs, fermented to the sound of ancient psalms. Nothing was done in a hurry. Each step was an offering.
Mixing the ingredients was like writing a hymn.
Sweetening was like praying for someone far away.
Baking was like waiting for a season to come. And eating was a contemplative act. There were no forks.
There was no rush, just clean fingers and closed eyes. The first bite was always broken in silence. And the taste
was like listening to a musical note echoing inside your chest. The ingredients came from what was in the garden. No markets, no excess, soothing herbs, dried flowers, fruits picked at dawn. The honey was thicker.
The cinnamon was grated on the spot. The chestnut was crushed with small stones, washed in the stream.
And there was always an unexpected touch, a scent of lavender, a pinch of salt, a subtle bitterness that recalled the duality of faith.
Because even in the sweetness, there was reflection. The monks ate little, but they ate truthfully. It wasn't gluttony, it was gratitude. And each bite was an encounter with oneself, a pause in the day,
a caress for the thoughts. Eating sweets there was like entering an empty chapel and feeling that everything was in its place.
The stomach was satisfied with little, but the soul remained silent, at peace, because the sugar there didn't excite. It calmed. It was sweet like the sound of a bell in the distance. Sometimes the sweets were offered to travelers, as a blessing,
as a gesture of kindness. A monk would hold out a piece wrapped in rustic cloth,
and the traveler would take that sweetness with him like a reliquary.
Many kept it without eating it. Others shared it with strangers. But everyone, without exception, felt something when they tasted it. Something that did not come from the taste, but from the intention, from the care, from the silence of the person who prepared it.
Today, there are those who seek out these recipes.
Those who try to recreate them.
But they don't always get it right.
Because what made those sweets sacred wasn't just in the recipe.
It was in the rhythm, in the prayer, in the sound of the wind passing through the speakers.
In the Gregorian chant that echoed between the stones while the dough rested. It was an alchemy of time, space, faith, and sugar.
And maybe, just maybe, we can feel an echo of it when we close our eyes and remember.
And now, we leave the monastery with a last sip of soft liquor still warming our chests. We follow the paths of memory to a camp where soldiers rest, where the cold is constant,
and where, between battles, a salty snack can mean everything. Let's discover the salty snack that made soldiers smile,
and how, even in the midst of war, there was room for the taste of hope. On the edge of a muddy field, under a cloudy sky and heavy hearts, a group of soldiers gathered around a timid fire.
The battle had ceased, but fear still lingered. Their hands were shaking, their eyes were distant, and then one of them took a piece of dried meat wrapped in cloth from his sack.
Another brought a salty paste made of roasted grains with salt and garlic. A third brought a handful of bran rescued from an abandoned village.
It was little, but it was something.
And at that moment, it was everything. These snacks didn't come with recipes.
They were improvised, carried in tight bags, hidden under armor.
They had to last for days, withstand the cold, the heat, the fear.
But they carried more than salt. They carried home.
Memories,
The texture of childhood cooking. The smell of a mother by the stove.
a familiar taste in the midst of the unknown.
Each bite was a short trip to the safety of a time that didn't hurt. They ate in silence.
But their eyes said it all.
There was relief. There was gratitude.
The food, even though hard, even though scarce, broke the rigidity of fear.
It was a gesture of humanity in the midst of brutality, a moment of pause between metallic noises and whispered orders. Salt stuck to the tongue,
The brain got between the teeth,
but no one complained,
because each particle was a reminder that the body was still whole. Some shared.
even with little.
A piece of meat passed from hand to hand. A spoonful of pasta offered without words.
It was the spirit of sharing, of caring.
Because they knew that eating together was also fighting together.
It was keeping alive something that war could not erase, the sense of community.
Of companionship, of human warmth. And it was there, among exhausted soldiers, that flavor took on another meaning.
It became resistance. Sometimes someone would laugh.
A dry, brief laugh, born of a memory awakened by an old taste. And that laughter would spread. Soft, discreet, like a fire that is rekindled.
And for a few minutes, the field would no longer be a threat.
It would become an improvised home.
The wind would carry the smell of salty food far away as a sign that there was still life.
And where there is life,
There is hope.
today, war foods have become military packaging, nutritional formulas, calculated precision.
But they lack soul. They lack memory. Because what made medieval savory special was not its flavor. It was its context.
The invisible embrace it offered.
The courage it awakened. The memory that, even in the most arid field, it was still possible to feel pleasure.
It was still possible to smile.
And now, with that shy smile still vibrating in the air, we turn to another type of cooking.
A more discreet one.
More silent.
Made far from the eyes of official history.
Let's find the women who cooked without a name. Those who left recipes in memory, not in books.
It's time to honor the invisible hands that season centuries with affection.
Let's go there.
The oven is still warm, and there are stories baking in silence. They don't appear in books. Their names weren't carved in stone, nor their faces preserved in tapestry.
But their flavors, those survived. They still live today, disguised in tradition, in smells that come from ancient ovens, in words whispered in kitchens at dusk.
They were midwives, healers, grandmothers with deep eyes and nimble hands. And while the world spoke of wars and thrones, they cooked. They cooked to nourish,
To soothe.
to keep alive those they loved. Their snacks were simple, but full of intention. A piece of bread soaked in milk with herbs. A dumpling made with the previous day's leftover, fried until golden. A thick broth that warmed more than just the stomach. None of this was recorded, but all of this was remembered, passed down from generation to generation, through touch, through smell, through the silent observation of those who learn by watching. The recipes had no measurements.
They had rhythms.
They had pulses. They had a heart. These women knew the secrets of the land.
They knew when to harvest, when to rest, when to light the fire.
Their seasonings came from within. They were instinct and listening. They cooked with their eyes fixed on the horizon and their ears attentive to the cries of their children. As they stirred the pot, they also needed sorrows, silences, hopes,
Each dish was also a message,
a request for calm,
an invitation to stay a little longer, to eat slowly.
to listen.
They didn't seek recognition.
They sought care. Their food was not decorated, but it had the aroma of shelter,
The texture of a lap.
the taste of a hug.
Those who ate it felt seen.
They felt part of something subtle, but powerful. And even those who didn't know how to say thank you with words, said thank you with their eyes closed and their breath deep. Because that food was more than sustenance. It was company.
It was present. It was love, served warm.
There was magic too,
Not the kind of spells, but the kind of transformation.
of a little that became a lot, of water that became soup.
Of bran that became cake. Of the smell that filled an entire house.
These women created alchemy with what they had.
And what they had, often, was almost nothing.
But even so, they created flavor. They created memory. They created time within time.
They were silent chroniclers of the history of food.
Today, when we repeat gestures in the kitchen without knowing why, like blowing on the broth before serving, like saving a piece of bread for someone who is absent, we are listening to these voices. They are passing through us. Their hands still guide ours, even if we don't know it. Their flavors still live in us, even if with new names, because memory cooks in silence. And love, too.
And with this memory hanging in the air, we return to the street.
And there, in the distance, we hear a familiar sound,
a sound that you may not notice at first, but that soon fills everything. The sound of chewing, grinding, cracking, sighing. Let's go to it.
Because sometimes it's the sound of food overcoming hunger that reminds us that we're still alive.
And that the body, in its own music, also knows how to give thanks. There was no silverware in most homes, and even when there was, it was rarely used.
Eating was an audible act, a sincere, shameless sound. Chewing was music.
It was present.
It was an announcement that food had arrived.
And more than that the body was there, alive, functioning. The crunch of stale bread, the crackling of toasted roots, the hurried breath of someone blowing on a hot spoon before putting it in their mouth.
All of this formed an intimate, ancestral soundtrack that filled the house and its surrounding.
In a small village, the sound of food being chewed at dusk was as sure as the church bell.
Windows would open, smells would escape, and soon the sound would spread.
It was like a disorganized but harmonious choir. Children eating in a hurry,
Old people chewing their cud slowly.
adults falling silent for just a moment, then commenting quietly between bites.
It was a celebration of survival.
Of continuity, of the routine that followed.
No one thought it was strange. No one told them to shut up.
Because the sound of chewing was also the sound of resistance.
After a day of work, after a tiring harvest, after overcoming a fear,
Hearing someone chewing next to you was like hearing a song
of flesh and bone.
of saliva and bread. It was knowing that, despite everything, we were together.
And that there was warmth.
There was food. There was life. There was humor in it too. Comments about who chewed the loudest.
Discreet laughter. Affection exchanged between one noise and another. Sometimes a child would fall asleep with food still in his mouth, and the mother, smiling, would listen to that last sound of chewing dissolve into sleep.
It was like a ritual, like a sign that all was at peace. And that, at least for today, hunger had been silenced.
Not with opulence, but with enough.
Today, chewing has become an unwanted noise. We cover our mouths. We ask for silence. We forget that this sound was once a sign of blessing. That in other times, listening to someone eat was like listening to one's own past.
Because there is comfort in the sound of someone eating with gusto. A reminder that the body still pulses, still feels, still needs.
Maybe it's time to listen to this sound again with affection, with respect, with gratitude.
Close your eyes now and imagine.
A wooden house, a lit candle, two people sharing a piece of bread, the light sound of chewing, the crackling of the crust, the breathing between one bite and the next, the night outside, the silence all around.
And that small sound, like a sigh from the world saying, "You are here."
You are fed, you can rest, and so our journey comes to an end, with the most human sound of all, that of a body being cared for.
May these stories stay with you like soft echoes, and the next time you hear someone eating,
Perhaps you will also hear the past, whispering gratefully.
because remembering is also slowly chewing on memory, and sometimes it is in memory that we find the best flavor.
Good night.
And may rest come as sweet as